Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to the last in the winter series of lectures. Tonight, as we join myself, Malcolm MacDonald, and our Honorary President, Sandy Matheson, he is talking about his great-uncle, Roderick Smith, then Provost of Stornoway, and the famous Scottish comedian Harry Lauder at the opening of the Bowling Green at Behead in 1922.
Still just owned the island of Louise and the town of Stornoway. And his two guests, one was Roddy Smith, my own granduncle, and the other, far more important, internationally famous gentleman was him with the little crook stick and the song. Who was he then? We should maybe be asking the audience.
Harry Lauder.
Sir Harry Lauder came up and stayed overnight at the castle, and he performed the opening ceremony. But that was only in New Behead. Originally, Behead was not a street. It was an area town of Eye, the head of the bay, out by the Porter's Lodge. And the main habitation at that time, going back to 1840, 1841, 42, was a place called Mill Street. Now, Mill Street was, I think, you'll appreciate it, in 1841, that was short time before I was born myself. And it was a shanty town, I think. There were over 400 people living in it, and by all accounts they were living in pretty grim conditions on Mill Street. Now, Mill Street is roughly where the new entrance into the castle grounds is, not the Porter's Lodge, which wasn't there then, but just further up the road at Willow Glen.
Yeah, Willow Glen Road.
If one of my other friends was here, I would point out that it's a shanty town then, and as long as he stays in a shanty town now. But never mind. Poor Booley won't
He's
like
over
that.
in Marvick, I think.
But Mill Street, as I say, was a bit of a dump, a shanty town, and the creation of Behead Street that we know now, much closer into town, was for two reasons really. One, Sir James Matheson, who bought the castle in 1843 and owned the whole place, wanted to clear the village of Rannoch. Now, those of you who play golf will know where Rannoch is, but up at the top of the little hill we call Rannoch, there was a small community of, I suppose, crofters or smallholders, and Leverhulme had them moved. Now, when I say he had them moved, not Leverhulme, Sir James Matheson had them moved. Yes, Clendale?
Carry on.
You didn't tell me I had to put it on. Okay, it's on now, it's on green. Anyway, Sir James Matheson was not the kind of landlord who compelled people. When he moved them from Rannoch, he moved some of them down to new plots on what we now know as Behead Street, starting from, I was going to say Mitchell's Garage, but perhaps you won't know where Mitchell's Garage was. It's where the Spar grocery is now on the Golden Acre.
They soon will, because Colin Tucker's writing a book about Mitchell's Garage. And
Oh, well.
so
Well,
watch this space.
We'll come to Mitchell in a minute, but I think it would be better if I had a lawyer with me.
Which side of Behead will we start on? Or are we going to go from Mitchell's in town, or go from...
We're starting at the Porter's Lodge end.
Oh, are we?
No, I'll tell you.
And
no,
another
no.
thing, Sandy, you
No.
forgot to say that there were houses on the other side of the road, one or two of them, because we have the Historical Society have an image. I can't remember the name.
Ken somewhere there.
Yeah, Ken or Willie?
Is it the Hans Busk one?
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
It's the what?
And there are two. Hans Bus, Hans without the D. Hans Bus.
The Harris bus.
Hans.
No. Never mind. Never. You just be quiet. Yeah, we're going to start, just starting at that end, but we'll come into number 1 in a few minutes.
For those watching in America, I've got to explain. Sandy is deaf. So he's not, because they might think you're a bit slow.
Sandy is what?
I'm saying you're a bit deaf. You've got to remember there's Americans watching this.
Oh, they're deaf too. But anyway, let's stop interrupting. We're coming in Behead at the Porter's Lodge. Now, I said Sir James moved the people from Ranelagh down on to what we now know as Behead Street, as distinct from the generic name Behead. And he also moved some of the people from Ranelagh out to Cross Street. And I may have told you this little story before about Cross Street. You all know where Cross Street is. It goes from Percival Road down to the Cockle-Ebb. Well, if you were living here 50, 60, 70 years ago and did a census of Cross Street, you would find that most of the people who had crofts there had the surname Monroe. Not Pongo, but Monroe. And there's a reason for that. When the people were moved from Ranelagh, the little village up on the top of the golf course, to their new crofts, the man in charge of the administration of the movements was the infamous factor. What was his name again?
Donald Monroe.
Donald Monroe. Monroe. And as the crofters who were accustomed to having their names in the old patronymic, Ian, Mac, Colm, Mac, Rory, and that was their name. They didn't have surnames, most of them. And some bright spark, when he was going up to get his allocation either in Cross Street or in Behead, had the brilliant idea when the Shamelon Monroe said, "What's your name?" And he had seen other people being humiliated because they had not been able to give a Christian name. And as quick as a flash, he said, my surname is Monroe. Because Donald Monroe was sitting in front of him. Oh, lovely. And he got a good croft. And then the next few people who saw this happening, whatever their name was, what's your name? Monroe. And the whole of that area was full of Monroes because they got the better hand of the big Monroe.
And what about the Mothersons?
The Mothersons, we went to Newton. Anyway, the people from Ranelagh went to Cross Street and some of them went to Behead Street. So it was about 1855 or 56 that Behead Street was formerly known as Behead Street. And now, against that background, Malcolm, and I know it's very, very difficult for the likes of you or myself to count backwards, we'll go to number 1, Behead. That's in at the bottom of Spoils, the bottom of Spoils Brae.
The bottom of Kenneth Street.
Kenneth Street, where Kenneth Street comes down on to Behead Street. And some of the people who lived there are important.
Spoil was a Persian.
Spoil was a Persian. He had a set of houses up on Kenneth Street, and he was the father of a very famous school teacher called Miss Alina.
Yeah. MacLeod.
MacLeod. Spoils Brae it was called. Like many of the other places in town, I was talking to two charming young ladies earlier this afternoon, and I was pointing out that many of the streets in Stornoway are named after people, but before they became formally known, they were just known as Campbell's Close, whoever Campbell was, or Spoils Brae, and Young Sprae down in the Battery, and then later on they got...
And Leddingham's Brae.
Yeah. Leddingham's, Contor's Corner. Yeah. You all know where Contor's Corner is. It's where young Mr. Glover has his cycle shop now. Lovely restoration of that building. I've got to get that off my chest. That building was going to rack and ruin. And Mr. Glover and his friends have turned it into a rather nice place. Anyway, that was Conter's Corner, Campbell's Close, Spoilsbury, the first house at the bottom of the Brae, Malcolm. It wasn't the Nicholson family, and I'll come to them. At the bottom of the Brae, it'll be number 1. I know that in the 1930s there was a doctor living in there, Dr. Miller, not Dr. Miller,
Dr. Fraser.
Dr. Fraser. Oh, that was later on, Malcolm. Yeah. Anyway, we're now...
Dr. Angus McCrae.
That's a very man, very man. He was in the bottom, you know where we are. We're at the bottom of Kennel Street, and we're going to go out on the north side of the street. And there was Dr. McCrae, and he had a close, there's still a close there, that goes up round the back behind Poots' house, I think. But
and then there's the next close again is the one into Ronnie Mackenzie's.
The man who had that house at one time was Mackenzie Morrison. John...
Oh, McRitchie Morrison.
No.
The first salesman.
John Mackenzie Morrison. Now, John Mackenzie...
He was a councillor.
He was a famous guy on various bodies, and he was a son of Sandy Morrison, the rope maker, out at the other end of Bay Head. Anyway, that house was perhaps not built by him, but it was occupied for many years by John Mackenzie Morrison, quite a famous, well-known citizen. One of his 7 children was B. Morrison. B. Morrison married Ronnie McLean, and of Calmskeanock's crowd, and was the John McCritchie.
That's Malcolm McLean.
Was the grandfather of Malcolm McLean, the baker in Stornoway, and Sandy and Norman the taxi, and all these McLean.
Of Stag Bakeries, etc.
Yeah, which was, funnily enough, going back out to Stag Bakeries, was owned by Ronald McLean at one time. But anyway, that's number 1, John Mackenzie Morrison. And it was number 2, I think, was owned by the Nicholson family. The Nicholson family of the Nicholson Institute. The original Nicholson came from Uig Angus Nicholson, and like many another good person from what we would like to call Landward Louis. I know that other people have different names for the people who come from Landward Louis, but I'm talking about Landward Louis. And he came in from Uig, having been involved in the fisheries in Loch Rogue. And ultimately, because he had done quite well, he came to the centre of commerce, and he moved into Stornoway, and he built up a very successful fish exporting business, not just herring, but often line-caught fish out from the west side of Louis, taken in, and he was, if you want, the middleman who got it all sent. So that was Angus Nicholson, the grandfather. No, Angus Nicholson was the father of Alexander Nicholson, the founder of the Nicholson Institute. And of course, you all know, most of you having gone to the Nicholson Institute will know that there were a big family. There were 5 brothers. Haven't got time to mention them all tonight. But the youngest of the brothers was called Alexander. And he made his way ultimately out to China. He was an engineer, and he was working in Shanghai on a boiler in a ship, and the boiler exploded to his demise. And Alexander, who was only 37, I think, he was a young man.
He was in his 30s, yes.
Had already made his will. And his will said that his estate was to go to Stornoway to fund a school, so that the families, the sons actually, of his friends could have a proper school. Now, that was the founding of the Nicholson Institute in 1871. And before that, there had been other schools on Keith Street, on Church Street and so forth. So that was the Nicholson family. Interesting, very interesting, because we were talking about America. One of the Nicholson boys went out to the southern states of America and he owned a plantation. And of course, if he owned a plantation, what else did he own? Slaves. And he, don't know what kind of a slave master he was, but he certainly owned a plantation. And in the American Civil War, what, 1862 to 65, he was on the southern states side. The side that lost, the slave side, if you want, not the north, which was Abraham Lincoln and the other people. But
was he gun running?
what?
He was gun running.
He was gun running.
Apparently so.
What else would you expect in America but gun running? Shouldn't have said that. He had a big plantation.
The CIA are watching now.
He was, even after the Civil War had ended, he refused to accept the result of the war. And he became a fanatic, a bit of a single issue man. And ultimately he got arrested and he was in a camp for a wee while, a jail. But when he was back out in his own plantation, there wouldn't be slaves by now, he actually heard something about the Civil War and he got so angry that he had an apoplectic fit and died. Now that was Mr. Angus Nicholson. There are another Nicholson down in Yorkshire who built up a huge mill empire. There was another Nicholson boy who became a minister, and it was he who gave us the money for the clock tower that Kenneth Galloway spoke about so interestingly a couple of years ago. Famous family, the Nicholsons.
Another one out in Australia.
Yes, he was a sheep farmer.
Yes. Yeah.
They all did well. But the interesting fact is that none of them were educated in Stornoway, because there was no school. There might have been an infant school, but they all went away to Glasgow, yes, or to Inverness Academy at the top of the Reigning Stairs, if any of you know where the Reigning Stairs in Inverness are.
Well, Academy Street.
Academy Street.
Yeah.
The steps up from Academy Street up to the top of a town called the Reigning Stairs.
That's it.
After Mr. Reigning, who was a schoolmaster, and it must have been that school that the Nicholson boys went to. Right, we move on after Nicholson. Who's next in your list? Not by number.
Well, number 3, the Smith family.
Which Smith?
The Croy Smith.
Oh yes. Oh, but that was much later on.
Yeah, I know, but that's the house.
They had the wholesale grain merchants. They weren't called Smith. Wasn't the name of the company originally. Anyway, yeah. Yes, Malcolm was quite right.
You're seeing the MacArthurs further along.
Nowhere further out. No, Ian Smith, Croy's father.
I know Harry Lauder's got to get to the end of the road, but wait a minute or two.
Anyhow, would you like to take over?
No, I think you're doing very well.
Right. The Smith family, well, that's in our generation. Ian Smith, who died also as a young man. He lived up on Gotill Road, and he had a family, Croy and Margaret and Mabel and Malcolm. But he had a wholesale grain merchants.
That's right.
And these people who are grain merchants, they also had something else very interesting. They always had stables. It sounds like something straight out of the Wild West. They had stables where, when the people came in from the country, from the landward area, much as they do now, take up all the car parks, they would take their horse to the stables, and it would be stored in the stable and be fed and be looked after whilst the gentleman did his business in the town. So he was into horses and horse food and all the rest of it. That company finished about 1964 or 65. And the interesting part for those of you today is that is where Ronnie Mackenzie has his wonderful loom shed, where he's doing a very good job with tourists and whatnot, telling them all about the Bjarsh and how to work it and all the rest of it. So that's the Smiths, Malcolm.
Yeah.
Who's next?
Number 4.
Never, not after number 3.
Number 4 was a Kenneth MacLean, a shoemaker, but he was put out of business once Dolan started undercutting him. So it then became, in the 50s, a woman called Miss A. Murray, Kipperani.
Kipperani.
Do you remember her?
No, you tell us about her.
Well, she lasted for quite a while, and well, it was like the Mormac restaurant, except it was mostly kippers and herring. People went along there and got their cheap grub, you know.
Didn't know that.
Yeah. So she was from the back area.
I don't think, Malcolm, we'll have time to stop at everyone.
No.
We should maybe jump all the way out to McKeever's garage.
Well, I think that's just about it, yeah. Well, Miller's garage, then McKeever's garage.
Oh yes, Miller's garage, of course. Remember Miller's garage with the pump, with the long arm
It would swing out.
that came out over the pavement? Long before health and safety came, and you would go there and get your petrol from Albert Thompson.
That's right, yeah. Illigan Plantation.
Now, the Miller's garage, for those of you who may not know, the Miller family came here at the end of the 1890, whatever
That's right.
century that was. 19th,
Yes.
yeah, right. And they came from the mainland, and the first miller who came here was actually in charge of the gasworks. Those of you who remember the gasworks on Bells Road, where Tesco is now, there was the gasworks. And Miller came here as the manager of the gas place.
Yes. The gasworks started in the 1860s.
Now this Miller had a son that some of us know anyway, called Louis Miller. And then Louis' son Alistair took over from his father and went away. He's living in Dingwall now. But Miller's garage was quite a famous place. And I know that the Miller man, not Louis but his father, was one of the kindest philanthropic gentlemen in the town. Because on one occasion, a little boy from Braga came in looking for a job, and Miller could detect talent when he saw it. And he said, "All right, John, what did you say your name was?" "John MacDonald." He says, "All right, John MacDonald, you come and start doing your apprenticeship with me." And that John MacDonald did his apprenticeship for a wee while, and then he was headhunted.
Who was it? He didn't fancy being called John the Mechanic.
No. He was headhunted, and in due course he became John the Chemist.
That's it.
So that's where your father started,
Absolutely.
as you know very well. I wonder why he was so keen on me taking Miller's garage into. Now we'll move on from Miller's garage
To McKeever's garage.
to McKeever's garage. One or two houses in between there, but was Sergeant Major Craig in there?
Oh no, he was further out. Yes,
He was
yes.
further out. Anyway, McKeever's garage, another famous family. In fact, I would say a son of that family. It was possibly the most famous Louis man
Robert.
from away from here, Robert McKeever. He became a very, very highly regarded professor of what we would now call sociology in New York or Washington, somewhere in
Eastern
America.
Seaboard, definitely.
What?
The Eastern Seaboard.
Yes, on the east side of America. I think it was New York. He was very, very famous, internationally known. He had been obviously in the Nicholson, he had been the Dux of Nicholson, and he went out to America at the beginning of last century, and he made a great name for himself and for Louis. He wrote a book which I haven't been able to get my hands on it, called A Tale That Is Told. But anyway, these McKeevers were also, there were other brothers who were quite well known.
Oh yeah, John McKeever, who wrote in the Gazette.
Yes, and the other brother, he was a photographer and a writer, and he wrote a great many articles for the Stornoway Gazette, which are well worth reading. He was writing those in the 30s, and he had wonderful photographs of the town and all the rest, and I just don't know where his photographic collection went to. But he too was well known. There was another brother who went to Canada and came back during the war. And they were, as I say, these McKeevers. I think they came from Braga.
There are McKeevers in Braga, but I'm not sure.
Well, I think so, but if he came from Braga, that wasn't his fault, really. So, that was the McKeever family.
And of course, the garage was taken over later on by the MacDonald family.
Oh, yes. You'll all remember the famous Alistair Archie, a gentleman from Point, who came up to town and
From Garabust.
from Garabos, yes, a cousin, an uncle of Mr. Callum MacDonald, the former MP.
Yes, yeah.
They were called the Archies.
And the
down at
son,
Point.
Archie, is working.
And we used to have a phrase when we were kids, and I'm not sure if it had anything to do with them, where if you were getting a bit above yourself, they would say to you, "Who do you think you are, Archie?" Now, I'm not quite sure who that Archie was, and it may very well not have been Archie MacDonald, Alistair Archie. Who else? Then after that garage closed, it was latterly the kilt shop.
Yeah, well, the kilt shop is where the offices are, yeah. Yeah. And of course, it was carried on as a garage until, a year ago by Kiwi.
Yes, Okay, that's McKeever's garage.
Yeah.
Now,
Are you going to mention, can we mention a shop that later became John Campbell's?
yes. Walter Neuf.
No, John Campbell.
Yes.
The new and Walter Neuf next door.
Next door to. Who was in that shop before Mr. Campbell?
I need to look up the date.
Well, of course, you'll all remember
sorry,
Campbell's newspaper shop started on Behead and that site about 1951 or 52. And I have to say, Mr. Campbell, like all people who were starting afresh in business, keen and enthusiastic, and he quite upset the newspaper routine. In those days, the newspapers came on Loch Seaforth, or earlier than that, on the Loch Ness. And as a consequence of that, the newspapers of the day didn't arrive in Stornoway until 8 o'clock or 8:30 or 9 o'clock when the mail boat got in. And of course the two newsagents in town, excellent firms, Nicholson's and Smith's, used to open up at that time to get the newspapers to open up for an hour for the citizens to get the paper which had been published everywhere else in the country at 9 o'clock in the morning. So we, and I was myself and perhaps some other people here, were what we would call barrow boys. We were allowed to help John the chemist and Colin Cameron to go down to the boat, get the papers out of a container and put them on the barrow, and then we would have a race up to see who could get into the shop first to sell the news.
Roddy Smith had a green barrow and Nicholson had a light blue barrow.
Yes,
It looked like Battleship Grey. I think they punched the paint.
don't know where they got that paint, but never mind. The interesting thing was Roddy Smith's barrow had iron-rimmed wheels. You know, like the old cart horses, big irons. Nicholson's went one better, and they had pneumatic tyres on their lorry. But Campbell came along, and he spoilt it all because he had a van.
With white walled tyres.
Yes. And he would get his papers up to Behead at much the same time as we were getting them opened in the shop. So that was Campbell's. But beside that shop,
Walter Neuf.
Walter
MacDonald.
Walter MacDonald. I'm sure you all remember dear old Walter, and his sister Hetty.
Yeah.
Hetty, would you believe it, was one of my Sunday school teachers. I think she must have marked me down as a failure. Anyway, Hetty was a lovely lady, for those of you who remember. But Walter Nerve was...
She had the hats in the hat shop.
He what?
She had hats, you know.
Yes, she had a hat shop. You're quite right. So she did. Hence the song, "Get Me a New Sunday Bonnet." Anyway, Walter, also having a vegetable and garden shop in that place, he was also the tenant of the kitchen gardens in the castle grounds, where the college is today. It was a big field with most fields have 4 walls, not fences, big stone walls.
Very high.
All the way round it. It had been the original castle kitchen garden, and Walter had a garden there, a lease for that garden for quite a few years. And because the boys from Manor or other parts of the town used to go out there and climb the walls,
And the castle boys.
to get snebs or whatever boys collected in those days. Walter got, and as they say in the local vernacular, took home 2 great Alsatian dogs. And I remember being told as a child how to handle a raging dog. You had to stand absolutely still. And
The way you used to when you were a goalkeeper.
no, that was later on. The dogs, they were Alsatian dogs, and actually poor Walter got into a bit of trouble with the police because someone went over the wall and his dog attacked him. But the dogs, funnily enough, and it's interesting for me anyway, the dogs were brought home by a gentleman we all knew as Dolangi Chisholm, who was a painter. And whether Dolangi had any expertise with dogs, I don't know, but he was in our house one morning and he was saying he had come back on the boat last night with ferocious dogs for Walter Nerve. Huge first Alsatians I ever saw. So that kitchen gardens ultimately became assumed into the college.
Yes.
Some of you will remember the shooting range beside the kitchen gardens with butts at the far end, which had originally been the tennis courts.
Tennis courts, yes.
For the castle. So
And it then became the castle football pitch.
correct, indeed.
Yeah,
Oh,
with one of the walls.
Uh-huh.
If the touchline was along the wall.
Yeah.
Get scraped arms.
Uh-huh.
And of course, it then became the car park.
It is now the Castle College main car park. So that tennis courts, and then
Shooting.
shooting, and then football, and now a car park. So that was Walter.
Of course, Walter Nerve was in charge further out ahead of the Gospel Hall.
Well, yes, indeed. Walter Nerve was originally in the High Church, and that's where Hetty was teaching me in the Sunday school. But he went and he created a branch of the Brethren.
Was it about 1952 or thereabouts? Yes.
Called, it's now the Gospel Hall on Behead, but it was Walter who was the founder of that. And then Walter, for those of you who are interested, built himself a nice little bungalow out in Laxdale at the bottom of what we call Dan Dougal's Brae.
Another Bray, yeah.
Another Brae. See what I mean about braes and hills and whatnot being called after people. No time to talk about Dan Dougal.
Sandy, did you hear that when the Gospel Hall was being built, there was rumours that they were going to have a pool in it? And this guy, I'd better not mention his name, went to Walter Nerve and applied to be the pool attendant. But I think he was a wee bit.
I didn't know that. Anyway, we'll move on from Walter to further out the road. Before we come to Boo Alan Craig's shop on the corner.
Johnny Oakes.
Oh, of course, Johnny Oakes, the bakers.
Yes.
opposite the Bridge Centre, right opposite the Bridge Centre. It's now Salka.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
The
Hamish
Afrin's
Afrin's
lady
daughter,
runs.
yeah.
That was Johnny Oakes.
Yeah, doing
Now,
Mackenzie's.
did I see some of the Johnny Oakes family here tonight, or am I just...
Oh, yes, yes.
Yes.
In the-
I knew some of the family was here. Okay, I won't say what I was going to say. No, Johnny Oakes had a wonderful shop, as well as his own bakery.
yeah. Oh.
And
the smells were just wonderful.
the smell of fresh bread in the morning was really something. My memory of Johnny Oakes was he also had a very special penny biscuit, like the Crackhan's biscuits, a big, good, strong biscuit that you had there. But Johnny Oak, on top of that, do any of you remember his yellow van for delivering the bread throughout the country? At least I think it was a yellow van, which he kept up in a garage on Keith Street. Anyway, famous family, and then the original Johnny Oak, he had his son, I'm not going to go into the whole family tree because I won't get it right, but he was another character in town. Now, this didn't happen in his shop. It must have happened in some other shop whose family isn't here tonight. And he had also sold these big biscuits. I think it must have been the Crackhan's biscuits, which were very, very famous. Remember the Crackhan's biscuits, boys? Anyway, they had these big penny biscuits in the shop on the counter. And in this particular shop, beside the penny biscuits, there was a barrel, as they had in those days, of butter. None of this fancy stuff wrapped up in paper. A barrel of butter. And when you went in with your penny to get a biscuit, the lady would say to you, "Here's a biscuit, would you like some butter on it?" Yes. So it was very good butter too.
Finger licking good.
So now that wasn't Johnny Oakes at all. That was like it might have been Maggie York's or something. So after Johnny Oakes, who moved later on to the built Stag bakeries,
Along with Kalmsky
which is only now, as you know, being demolished to build houses on at the bottom of Stag Road.
Yes.
Right, how are we doing, Malcolm? Oh, we're not even halfway along behead.
You said you wouldn't get going until 8:30.
Clocks went forward, that's what's done it. After Johnny Oakes, I'll tell you if you...
Well, of course you've got Warhorse and, Kinnairds and them.
Well, Bill Kinnairds' butcher shop.
Yes, well, Kinnairds at Angus MacDonald and
Angus MacDonald. Interesting little story. Do you want to know who the butcher was in there before the MacDonalds?
No, I don't.
You don't? Well, I do. His name was Roderick Matheson.
Oh,
Roddy Dowdy, my uncle. People don't know.
and what did he use to put the butter on his bread?
He put butter on both sides of the piece. Anyway, my uncle had a butcher shop there in the 30s.
Yes, that's right.
And my only connection with that butcher shop was that there was a bull's head. You know, every butcher had an ox head hanging on the wall. Well,
yeah, Ivy and Nooney had it, and up in McLean's on Keith Street.
Hanging up on the wall, like the way the Americans hang a moose on the wall.
You could put your Stetson up on
and that bull, whatever it was, hang on the wall out at Beddadove at my Roddy's house all my life, and when I went to take it off the wall, it fell apart with lice and mice. So anyway,
was there any money in it?
Angie MacDonald had his shop there.
Yes.
And Bill Kinnaird was the butcher in it.
Yeah.
And like many other places, you'll all remember Kinnaird's shop. Okay, we'll move out I'm anxious to get to Boo Alan Craig.
Well, Jeff, that's next then.
Do any of you know who I mean when I talk about Alan Craig? He had a shop on the corner of
Mackenzie Street
and Behead. And it was a famous shop. Alan Craig, the Craigs had come here years ago, 2 centuries ago. Was it with the terriers?
With the Astronomy Volunteers,
which
were the terriers eventually, yeah.
And he's not to be
he was at music, you know.
He was not to be confused with the other Craig, who was further out Behead. Some of you may remember Susan Craig, a domestic science teacher in the Nicholson. She was of the other Craig family. Anyway, Alan Craig's shop was famous throughout the island because it was a favourite stopping place for people coming in, getting their stuff and going out. Like all the shops, it was a general merchants. They sold a bit of everything. Mm-hmm. Okay?
Yeah. People remember it when it stopped being a shop. It was the SNP headquarters for a few years, and now it's become a house.
That's right. Now, it's at the bottom of not New Street, is it?
No. Mackenzie Street.
Bottom of Mackenzie Street.
Yeah. And then you go up in the plantation is the.
We didn't touch on the fact that was it in the house at the bottom of, you know, where plantation comes down into. Is that Mackenzie Street?
Yes, yeah.
Plantation Road comes down into Mackenzie Street at the junction with Behead.
Yeah, there was a small shop on the other side for a while. It's a music shop, and my mother worked on Monumental Masons, Calhoun's for a while. Remember Gary Hawthorne had a shop.
Gary Hawthorne had that.
And we missed out the Mohammeds as well.
Well, they're in further. Oh gosh, yes, they're on the far side.
Was it number 36?
Lovely phrase, far side. Still, which side is the far side? Like, one of the jokes we got is, which is the hairiest side of a horse? The outside. That was another thing. Anyway, I forgot about that. There was the shop. But all these places had originally been houses.
Yes, yeah.
And people.
Well, Wali Muhammad opened a shop in a house, and it's now reverted to a house, you know. But the family, you know, his daughter is next door, and that shop's still going on.
And there were some quite nice houses out there, you know, not little villas, but big villas where people of some substance and money actually had houses. Moving on out the road, we've come to the bottom of Mackenzie Street. That's where.
You've gone past Mackenzie Street, Alan Craig.
Yeah, but I'm trying to remember. You see, there are new council houses on Mackenzie Street.
Yes, yeah.
And I remember these houses being built, and there was a little story about them trying to widen what was a little lane. And before they built those houses, much earlier on, that lane had to be widened, and the houses that we now know were built there. At the bottom of the brae, on Behead Street, there was Stornoway lady, a character of a lady, called Mrs. Whittaker.
Tread carefully.
We'll just call her Mrs. Whittaker, who was a well-known lady on the town council and everything else. And to get Mackenzie Street widened and the fuse ready for Mackenzie Street, they had to buy some of her land. And she ultimately agreed to sell her piece of the land for 30 quid or something, but there was a tree in it, and one of the conditions was that the line would go round the tree so that it wouldn't be destroyed in the course of the building of the houses. And I think that tree is still there if you look in behind the house, an early example of green fingers or something. So that was Mrs. Whittaker. Will you carry on out?
Yeah. we come to Rossi's and Henderson's.
Oh, yes. Rossi. Who was there before the Hendersons? That was 51 Behead.
Yeah, but the Hendersons were there from the 1860s. The
Yes.
coach hirers with,
He
with
ca-
horses. They had
he-
stables there.
He came here, he was the first Royal Mail
Yeah, that's right.
deliverer with a horse
To
and cart.
Callanish and places
Uh-huh.
like that.
That was the well-known Henderson family. But Rossi, and Rossi had a sister called, who remembers Latta?
Yeah, that came from the mill.
That's,
Mary
the
Latta,
Lattas
yeah.
came from the mill out on the top of the golf course there, from Loch Winnoch in Renfrewshire.
That's right, yeah.
And their name was Latta, and the lady that we knew in the was Latta in the shop as well as Rossi. No. Were they both there?
Latta was in the army.
Uh-huh.
Nursing.
Now Rossi was one of those people who ran a lovely sweetie shop and bits and bobs.
Tiny wee shop, but
Uh-huh.
it had everything, up the way.
Don't think she
The
sold.
can-do.
I don't think she sold butter.
No,
But anyway,
but licorice pipes, everything.
she was a well-known lady, Rossi,
Yeah.
and after that,
She was across the road from the playground, so all the kids in the summer were back and forth.
it was also across the road from the brick-built opera house. No.
You never went in there. That was closer to the YM, so.
No, there was one
the old
just
days.
opposite there. There was a brick cloche-merle, a place for gentlemen to go. There was one down on the pier, two down on the pier, and there was one out there. And don't say it wasn't, because I remember it very
I
well.
thought you meant the one out at the YM.
Well, reminds me of a little story about the wickedness of Stornoway boys. A scene taking place in the Clochmerle down at the back of Amity House. And in those early days, the sanitary arrangements were such that you certainly got your own stall and your own bowlie to sit on. But they didn't have separate little pipes running to the drain. They had one big ditch shared by all the customers. And the Stornoway boys used to go to the upstream
It flushed sideways.
off the
water
drain. And they would get a piece of tarry rope or something,
Or a paper
or a
boat.
paper boat, and whenever anyone went in and sat down, they would take the paper boat and they would light it, and they would they would send it floating down. Wickedness. Oh,
And you had to be fast.
anyway, we're now going to come to Langley's shop.
But we missed out Henderson's off sales as well.
Off sales. Well, of course, that's
Andrew Henderson.
very
That's
modern.
very modern,
and Andrew Henderson and then his son.
And they had a petrol pumps as well.
Of course they did, yes. But that's a hangover from the garage days.
Yes, yeah.
Um,
Which the garage was round on
Round the back.
on Stag Road. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Well, the Stag Road
And you,
garage,
as you say, you're coming to Langley's in a second.
that was owned by the Stornoway Newcastle Trust.
Yes.
And Mr. Henderson had a lease of that on Stag Road, where the Salvation Army and the Kirkcare number
Yes, that's
one.
right.
Anyway, Langley's show, Mr. Langley, Abraham Langley. In my early days, he had his shop on Point Street, right down at the bottom end of Point Street, roughly where the MNI is now. Mr.
And of
Langley,
course, his brother had a painter.
Brother Angus
Dr.
had,
Angus.
had the painter's shop.
That's right.
And then Mr. Langley went out to that shop on Behead.
Yeah. And it became the post office.
It became Behead Post
19,
Office.
1951.
Was it again in 51?
Yes.
Good year 51. And he had an interesting shop. That was Mr. Abraham Langley. I'm sure many of you will know old Abe, who did a great deal of stuff for the old folk.
Yes. And he was a town councillor.
He was on town council. Oh, he was on the town council myself. I remember it, but he left shortly after I came on. Can't think why. But
your great grandfather and he didn't get on very well either.
No. Abe was one of his mates.
Oh, was he? Yeah.
Not my fault. So that was Mr. Langley. Now, moving out from Mr. Langley, I think we better come to the bottom of Stag Road.
Well, better mention that for people that are younger, Langley's is where the motorist centre was, Kiwis for a while, and now it's an office. I can't remember what it is.
It's now the agricultural office.
That's it, yes. Yeah.
For the college.
It's quite a unique building with a facade.
It was quite a very modern.
Yes.
Modern show.
Now we're missing, there were dentists out that way, like DJ MacDonald we passed, and then there was the recent dentists as well in Behead. DJ MacDonald was quite modern.
Who?
Lieutenant Colonel DJ MacDonald, the dentist.
He was in a rented town.
I heard he was very kind to you.
He was in a house. How many of you remember DJ MacDonald the dentist? Well, he lived in a Stornoway council house round the back of there, and DJ was a famous soldier and dentist and a character. We can come back up onto Kenneth Street, where some of you will remember his dental surgery on Kenneth Street, where the police station is now. And DJ and Johnny Matheson, Owlack the dentist from Gotill, had I was going to say a butcher shop, but I meant a dentist shop on the corner there. And it was very good DJ. Do any of you remember the fact that they had a voice tube? Not a bell or anything, but you would go in there, like we have on ships, turn to starboard. You would go in there and you would hear this disembodied voice saying, Mr. Matheson, and go upstairs. Now, DJ was interesting. He always worked late in the evening. Quite why, I don't know, but I know for an absolute fact that he had his tea. He didn't go home for his tea. He had his tea in the Royal. And then he would come in to attend to the patients in the surgery, and I was one of his patients. And he was a great character for telling stories about Gallipoli. He had been one of the Ross Mountain Battery boys in Gallipoli, and he told me a very interesting story that I didn't know. One of his compatriots in Gallipoli was my own Uncle Jack. And Uncle Jack was out in Gallipoli, and as you know, they were fighting the Turks. And on one occasion, a bomb or a shell or something went off in close enough proximity to Uncle Jack to knock him out. And when he came round, he could only speak in his native tongue, Gaelic. And he was promptly captured by 3 English soldiers who stuck him in the prisoner of war enclosure at Gallipoli. And one day, no one seems to have bothered about Jackie having gone missing. One day, DJ had business to go down to the prisoner's compound, and he saw this man. I know that. In a Turkish prisoner of war camp, along with a lot of other Turks. And he went up to him and he said, "Are you Jackie Dowdy?" And Uncle Jack said, "Oh yeah, I'm glad someone can speak English at last." He had been captured by an English regiment who didn't understand Gaelic, and they thought he was speaking Turkish. Anyway, that was DJ, who was a Lieutenant Colonel Donald John MacDonald from Carloway. His father had been the headmaster at Carloway Public School, and he was called Ronald MacDonald.
Yes.
And DJ, you may remember, he had a son called Ranny. Ranny's now dead, but his son, I see him on Facebook now and again. And a daughter, Mary Agnes, is out in Vancouver Island. But TJ was also the cause of me getting into severe trouble with Dr. Ferrier. Remember Dr. Ferrier? Dog with the drip on his nose.
Don't be snotty.
Dr. Ferrier, for some two years, I think, of my time in
CGS
school.
Ferrier.
What?
CGS, George Ferrier. Yeah.
Mhm. He taught physics at my day. Well, he taught science, and I was in his physics class. And a very polite little boy, I always used to sit with my hands like that on the desk, and he often looked at me, and nothing happened. But I went to DJ, the dentist, and I had 2 overgrown tusk fish teeth. I don't know what you call them. It's a technical word, like a vampire. And they came down there, and apparently I used to sit quite unconsciously with the fangs. And ultimately DJ was persuaded to take them out. And I went round and DJ took them out. And about a fortnight later, when I was all better, I was still sitting like that. And Ferrier came out of he was having a fag in the little room in the middle. He came out and he looked round the class and he saw me. And he ran and he jumped and he took me by the throat and said, "I've got you now. You haven't got your false vampire's teeth in today." And I had to tell him. I says, "Well, I'm sorry, your mate, DJ, the dentist, took them out." And he wouldn't believe it. Ferrier would not believe it. And I said, "Well, before you strap me, as he was going to do, you have a word with your fellow elder." I was clever. I knew they were both elders and Martins. "And you have a word with DJ and Mr. MacDonald, the dentist, and he'll put you right. And you know something, Dr. Ferrier never mentioned the matter again." So that's back to DJ.
Can we move on to the Mackenzie family?
Which Mackenzie family?
The painters.
Yes?
And the ice cream sellers.
Uh-huh.
They were a rather unusual family when you think of it. They had a painting firm and they also had a sweet shop selling ice cream. And they even had a tricycle with a pannier with ice cream, and they'd go around the town. Stop me and buy one. That was in the 30s.
I didn't know they had that mechanical.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. They were a famous family.
Famous family. And they're quite learned.
Samuel.
There was a doctor, Samuel Hanley Mackenzie. He was a member of the Halley Orchestra. For Stornoway, where he was quite unusual. But there was one of them was a doctor, and of course the rest were painters and what have you. But apparently they were able to sell ice cream during the war because the Americans had plenty of sugar and what have you, and would give it to them. So, whereas the Italians, they didn't have any ice cream. So,
I didn't know that.
There must have been some arrangement.
Where were they on Behead?
Well, no, that'd be just beyond Abe Langley's.
Oh, well, Okay, carry on out, Behead.
Yeah.
We'll soon be at Stag Road.
Yeah, just we can share. Yeah, the painter was Simon Mackenzie. I couldn't remember his name.
Simon Mackenzie, yes. That's not to be confused with where Norman had his painter shop, which was in beside Kinnairds.
Oh, yeah, Norman
Lacey.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're now at Stag Road, Malcolm.
Yeah.
Whether you like it or not.
Yes,
we're at Stag
that's
Road.
right. Yeah.
And of course you'll know that at the bottom of Stag Road, at one time there was a house right on the corner where the Salvation Army Citadel is now. And that house was demolished, and the county council built a little shed with an asbestos roof on it. And it doubled up as a dentist shop. It was the school dentist was.
Oh yes,
was in
right.
I think it was a gentleman called Ross, who I think the poor fellow, he must have had a crossover in his brain. That side of the brain deals with this hand, and that side of the brain deals with this hand, and there must have been a slight defect in the nervous system, because he would put your sore tooth to sleep with the anaesthetic, you know, a big needle on into your gum. And by the time the anaesthetic had taken effect, he would go and do another patient in another chair. But unfortunately, he frequently came back and forgot which side he had put the anaesthetic in, and he would pull out the tooth on the wrong side. Do you remember that?
He did that to me.
He did that to you.
He took out 4 on this side, and they should have been on this side. Luckily, they were baby teeth.
Anyway, that's why you would remember that little building.
Oh.
Then it became births, marriages, and deaths.
Yeah,
Part
that's
of the
right.
County
Yes,
Council.
yeah. And then George Whittaker had.
The sanitary
Yeah,
inspector.
with Douglas
had his-
Brecky, Callum Mackay, and
Uh-huh.
people like that.
And of course, that was knocked down, and it was Salvation Army Citadel was built
right,
there in
yes.
1991 or something. So that site there had been owned by the Lewis Castle Trust, and I think it's in that site that the other Craig,
Yes,
Sergeant Major Craig, who was a trumpeter as well in the trumpeter Craig, as I recall it, was in that house. But across the road where Stag Bakeries is now, there was another house. It's been exposed by the
Yes,
removing
yeah.
of the Stag Bakery, was a big house, which was is a guest house.
Yeah, it was the Lingerby guest house at one time.
The Lingerby.
Yeah. I can't remember, what's it called now?
Hebridean.
Hebridean, that's
Yeah. That was an old house, which was the factor's house up at the castle, because that house continued in the ownership of the Lewis Castle Trust until fairly recently, when it became the first guest house out there. Then we come to 3 little cottages,
Yes.
3 or 4 little cottages.
There were 1 or 2 little shops in there at one time.
And they were prone to flooding. I remember people in shops in there, and they used to have the most dreadful time. And there was a lady in one of those houses who lived away, and she had often was called back because her house had flooded with the Glen River and all that stuff coming in. And then, and perhaps to end it all, we come to the Golden Acre.
We've done Harry Lauder, we've got to the end of the road.
Yes, we've got to the end of the road.
So the Golden Acre, tell them why it's
The
called
Golden Acre. I'm sure some of you at least will have heard of the Golden Acre, the site where Norman L. MacDonald has the petrol station. It was a small open piece of ground until in the 1930s, owned by the Stornoway Trust, and part of what was called Lady Matheson's plantation, because Lady Matheson 100 years before that had insisted on a plantation of trees down that side of Matheson Road. It's all gone now, but you can understand where the name plantation comes from, other than Ullapool Street. Anyway, John Mitchell bought or leased or rented, I can't remember this, I think he must have, maybe he bought it.
I think he bought it, yeah.
He bought the site in order to build his garage. And the trust, in one of its fits of irresponsibility, immediately heard that townsfolk were up in arms because the plantation was going to be destroyed for a garage. And they went to the trustees and they created Mary Hill. What did the trustees do? The trustees changed their mind
and tried to withdraw things.
and withdrew the offer to John Mitchell. And John Mitchell, quite naturally, said, "You can't do that. You've sold it to me. It's mine." "Oh yes, we can." And that case, John Mitchell versus Stornoway trustees, it went to the local court. It went to Edinburgh. Went to the Court of Sessions, and ultimately, I think, and Colin might keep me right, it went as far as the House of Lords.
Yes, yeah.
On appeal, and one court would say yes and the other court would say no, and it made it all the way up to the House of Lords.
It's a famous case.
It is one of what they call a precedent case, where even now, when there's a land dispute, people refer to Mitchell versus Trust, and ultimately John Mitchell won. It must have cost thousands of pounds.
It almost bankrupted the trust.
Bankrupted the trust.
Nearly did.
Well, trust didn't.
The funny thing was, at the 1938 carnival, there was a float, was just a big white case with a leg sticking out, 2 legs sticking out, and a head, and they're all painted white, and on it was the Mitchell case. And the Historical Society have a photo of that.
So that, to end the story.
And hopefully it'll be in your book, Colin.
So that is why it was called the Golden Acre, because it cost so much in fees and so forth.
And then sort of later in life, Mitchell's garage was costing too much in terms of the council, and so Ian Mitchell removed the roof from the car sales room.
Well, as I'm sure many of you will remember, the gradual development of that garage from a shed to much bigger. And of course, Mitchell's had the buses and so forth, but we're not going to go into that because one of our audience is busy working on John Mitchell.
He would have to have another book because we would tell a totally different story.
I'll tell you what, when are we going to be out of here?
Well, whenever the kick us.
What?
Whenever the kick us.
Oh.
I think we've got the current council officer isn't as pernickety as the previous one, so we could manage another 5 or 10 minutes.
Well, can I tell you one more story about if you go across Matheson Road, which at one time was called Rath Ur, the new road. Anyway, when you cross over there, we come to the Black Pudding Empire, Charlie Barley's shop. Now, that shop was only built there in 1947.
Correct.
On a piece of ground that was a long, narrow piece of ground with its front, a bit in front of the present butcher's shop. And it went all the way back up to what is now called Westview Terrace.
Yeah. Roper Cottage was...
In those good old days, it was called Ropework Road and Ropework Cottage, because the rope maker's cottage was on Westview Terrace.
Yes.
I remember it, a little house with green windows. Green surrounds on the windows. And
there's a modern, relatively modern bungalow on the site.
there is now a modern bungalow, and that was Sandy Morrison's house. I mentioned Sandy Morrison before as being the father of John Mackenzie Morrison. So you had the interesting thing, a father with a rope works at the top end of Behead and a son of business capability at the other end, but that rope work there, and you'll remember that a rope works of necessity was a long, thin site, and at each end there would be a big post like the mast of a ship, and it was round that post that the people would wind the hemp to turn it into a rope. And there were 3 rope works in Stornoway. There was another rope work for the Seaforth Hotel this hotel here, what's it called? Calla Inn. There used to be a rope maker there who was on Bell's Road, but the most famous rope maker was this guy, Sandy
Have you told the taxman?
It's what's known as a Freudian slip. The only rope that I'll get made for me will be... Anyway, Sandy was a famous man, very much involved in church, and he was in the He was one of the people who started off the Free Church on Kenneth Street, and then was into the founding of Martin's Memorial Church, which at that time was the English Free Church. It wasn't Church of Scotland.
Did you know, Sandy, that when the Free Church went on fire, was about 18,
That's right.
they met in the
ropework shed
with paraffin flares going off. So it was a very, very long. I don't know how the minister would have been speaking to the far end.
That's right. It was a long, thin,
Yes.
narrow shed. But the interesting thing about Sandy Morrison was he was a man of considerable courage, because when Lord Leverhulme wanted to build the Porter's Lodge, I told you that he had moved the people from Mill Street into various other parts of the town. He cleared the shanty town so that the approach to his castle and this lovely new Porter's Lodge was built by, I think, by McCrae from Melbus, but I'm not awfully sure that he built that. He certainly built the sea wall. But the Porter's Lodge was, and Matheson wanted to clear the whole area, and he wanted to clear Sandy Morrison's rope work. And Sandy Morrison stood up to him and argued his case about he wasn't going to move his rope works for anyone. And ultimately, Sir James or Monroe stepped back. So I always remember, not that I knew him, but of him, as being the man who stood up to the laird, who could quite easily have just had him evicted. So that was Sandy Morrison in the rope works. And the road that I'm talking about used to be called Ropework Road, and it went all the way from Matheson Road up to Coolagrain Road, which is now called Percival Road.
Yeah.
And the houses on the top side of that road, which were built by the council in the 1920s, were elevated. You know, if you look at some of those houses, they're up a wee thing. That was a terrace that the houses were built on, and it was called Westview Terrace. And sadly, over the years, Ropework Road has disappeared and is now
It's all
called
Westview Terrace.
Westview
It was
Terrace.
a decision made in 1957.
And I always thought it was a terrible mistake. Ropework Road is much more interesting and, if you want, nostalgic, romantic even, than, if you forgive me, Westview Terrace.
Well, yeah, Westview could be anywhere. Are you? You'd be down for a cup of water? There's some over there, Sandy.
Oh, thank you.
Took me a while to tip. Well, thank you all for coming along, folks. As you know, coming in tonight, the sun is out, and so this is the end of the winter series of lectures, but we will be back again in October of next year with another 5 lectures, hopefully. Of this year. I'm totally confused. I think you should have chosen a better chairman. Thank you all for coming along, and safe journey home.
Yes.
Thank you.